Welcome to Bed Crime Stories podcast. I'm your host, T. Hope you guys are all doing well post-Christmas, post the holidays, on to the new year. As always, I'd just like to ask that after listening to this video or watching it, you enjoyed it, you find you learned something, please do me a favor, hit that like button. And if you're not yet a member, please consider subscribing. Let's get started. The case of the 4 slain University of Idaho students remains unsolved more than a month out. Desperate to understand the type of person who could do in 4 young people in such a brutal manner and manage to elude the police for this long, many of us in the true crime world have looked to expert criminal profilers for answers. Sadly, the criminal profilers on YouTube, like the rest of us, don't have access to the case files. They cannot see the autopsy reports, nor can they examine the crime scene as it was before investigators first stepped inside the house at 1122 King Road. So they're trying to come up with a profile of this offender without the most telling evidence. Still, they're using what we, the public, all know about the crime. Details such as the house and property that the offender targeted, the time of day when the crime went down, the type of weapon the offender used, the tidbits of information the coroner and Kaylee Gonsalves's father have shared about Kaylee and Maddie Mogan's injuries, and what can be gleaned from the very attractive and popular students' social media accounts. They will also be considering the students' victimology, as in what activities, if any, in the slain students' lives might have increased their chances of falling victims to such a violent crime. Were any of the students using illicit substances unbeknownst to their families? Substances that could have brought them in contact with the criminal element in Moscow. Sometimes kids leave secret lives, right? We all do. Could the attractive girls' Instagram accounts have caught the eye of someone living in or near Moscow who became obsessed with one or more of them? Basically, why were these specific 4 people done in by this offender? And then, who had the means, motive, and opportunity to commit the crime? Meaning, who had that specific sharp-edged object? Who was in the area on that early Sunday morning in November? Who knew how to enter the home and where to locate the students? And who had a reason for wanting to do these 4 human beings in? Who might have been ferociously angry with one or more of those students? Criminal profilers consider all these factors and more to try and puzzle together a profile of the offender. Today, I want to talk about the world's first official crime profiler, now retired FBI Special Agent John E. Douglas, who was part of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Unit. No one can be a savvy true crime aficionado if they don't know who John E. Douglas is. As I discuss Douglas, I will be sharing some of the tenets that enabled him to track down numerous serialists, tenets that I believe the Moscow Police Department and the FBI special agents are likely following right now on the case in Moscow, Idaho. And the best way to share John E. Douglas's methods is to tell a bed crime story. It involves a chilling case out of South Carolina, something akin to a Silence of the Lamb's tale, only it's true, and Douglas was instrumental in solving it. So sit back by the fire, grab a hot drink, and allow me to take you on a journey. On June 3rd, 1985, a call came into the Federal Bureau of Investigation from the undersheriff of Lexington County, South Carolina. The frantic undersheriff was seeking help in tracking down a ruthless offender who had grabbed a 17-year-old female from the end of her own driveway and then peeled away. As in Silence of the Lambs, The girl's family was beyond desperate to rescue their beloved family member back from what appeared to be a real-life boogeyman. This is a story that demonstrates, once again, how a family's life can be forever altered in a few split seconds. On Friday, May 31st, 1985, in broad daylight, Sherry Faye Smith, a blonde and blue-eyed high school senior with 80s-style Farrah Fawcett hair and a fetching face to match, had just arrived home in her blue Chevette. She and her family lived on Platte Springs Road in Lexington, South Carolina. After Sherry pulled into the long driveway of the family home, she put the car in park, but left it running. She got out and walked over to the mailbox to pick up the family's mail. It's a benign activity that I remember doing after school as well, grabbing the mail from my family's mailbox, which was also at the end of our driveway. Who would think the few minutes in which such a simple, normal, everyday activity would be accomplished could lead to a family being forever changed and forever scarred? Sherry Smith's father, Bob, a pastor at Lexington Baptist Church, was even home inside his office, a mere 700 feet from where Sherry was picking up the mail. In fact, Bob noticed his daughter's blue car parked at the end of the driveway. She was so close to safety, but yet so far from it. In mere seconds, a car careened up, parked, and an armed man got out. Much like in the Delphi case in Indiana, the perpetrator used a dangerous object to force Sherry into compliance. In this case, that object was flashed to coerce the teen into a car, a vehicle that would whisk her off to a land of terror. Before this happening, Sherry had been so excited that day. This was because she was going to graduate from high school 2 days later. In fact, she'd been chosen to sing the national anthem at the ceremony. And after that, there was a senior class trip to the Bahamas to look forward to. Like the 4 slain students in Idaho, Sherry Smith had everything in the world going for her. She was attractive, highly social, and a go-getter. Her future held so much promise. When Bob Smith didn't hear Sherry drive up the driveway and come inside the front door, he headed out to the end of the driveway. There he discovered Sherry's Chevette, still running with the door open, but no Sherry. Inside the car on the seat were his daughter's black shoes and her purse. And inside the purse was Sherry's diabetes medication, meds that she could not survive long without. Bob knew there was no way Sherry would go anywhere without her purse and her meds. He immediately called his wife, and he recalls saying this to her in that moment. "Honey, I don't know how to tell you this, but Sherry's car is at the end of the driveway running, and she's not in it." End quote. Bob's next call was to the cops. A huge search effort ensued. It wasn't long before a 24-hour command center was set up in a tractor trailer near the Smiths' house. But as day turned into night without any sighting of Sherry or any communication from her, her parents were in a state that only other parents whose kids have gone missing can truly understand. There's no comfort, sleep is tortured at best, and when you awake, you're right back in your real-life nightmare. 2 days after Sherry's disappearance, an anonymous caller rang the Smiths' house from a payphone and asked to speak to Sherry's mother, Hilda. Note that this man enjoyed toying with females. In particular, he liked feeling a sense of power over them. That's why he took Sherry, and that's also why he wanted to speak to Hilda Smith and not to Sherry's father, Bob. The man told Hilda that he had Sherry. To prove it, he described the black and yellow swimsuit that Sherry had been wearing under her clothes on the day she vanished. The man told Hilda that he would release Sherry, but in the meantime, he and Sherry were eating and watching TV. The man also told Hilda to keep an eye out for a letter that he'd sent to their home. The investigators working the case were so eager to see the contents of that letter that they made the postmaster open the post office early. The letter was in Sherry's handwriting, and it was titled Last Will and Testament. Is there any worse title for a letter from a child's captor? In the letter, Sherry told her parents not to let this horrid event ruin their lives. She also wrote this: I love you all so damn much. Sorry, Dad. I had to cuss for once. Jesus forgave me. End quote. Right from the start, the letter was screaming that whoever had their daughter had either already done away with her or was about to. It was a devastating blow for Hilda and Bob. While they wanted to remain positive, they could not ignore the title of the letter and its disturbing contents. On his next call to the Smiths, the mystery man further tormented Sherry's parents by saying that he and Sherry were now one soul. Hilda, not knowing exactly what that meant, pleaded with this stranger to allow Sherry to live. Sherry's particular form of diabetes insipidus, a rare variety, was such that she needed her medicine and to be extremely well hydrated to live. The caller told Hilda not to worry, that he was making sure Sherry was drinking plenty of water. He also told Hilda to arrange for an ambulance to be at the house so that when he did release Sherry, she could get immediate medical attention. This was basically a psychological assault on Sherry's emotionally fragile parents. On the one hand, the man is saying that Sherry's fine and he's going to let her go. But then on the other hand, he's implying Sherry needs urgent medical assistance. The caller was toying with the parents and causing them the maximum amount of distress. FBI Special Agent John E. Douglas was assigned to the case, and he immediately flew to South Carolina to assist the local police. The nabbers' cruel tactics were soon testing all of Douglas's abilities. From the start, Douglas realized that this offender was not an amateur. He could see that the offender was sophisticated and very streetwise. Douglas believed that whoever was doing this had committed similar crimes in the past. Using whatever he could learn about this guy from the crime itself, the calls the offender had been making to Sherry's family, and the contents of that cruel letter, Douglas began cobbling together a criminal profile. Among the details he jotted down were that this guy likely had a history of SA against women and had possibly attempted to grab other females in the past. Douglas also wrote that the offender was someone who had troubles in his interpersonal relationships. Douglas explained his profile of this offender in an interview he did with A&E True Crime. Douglas said, "They'll try marriage, but the marriage never works out." End quote. Douglas also knew that crimes like this one against Sherry Smith were historically interracial, meaning either white on white or black on black. So Douglas jotted down that the offender was a white male. Douglas also knew that this person taunting Smith's parents over the phone was using an electronic device to disguise his voice. This indicated to Douglas that this person likely had a background in electronics. Douglas added that detail to his profile as well. In the interview with A&E True Crime, Douglas explained how he typically goes about coming up with a criminal profile for this type of crime. He said, "As far as age, I usually start at age 25 with this type of violent crime. Here we have an abduction at a mailbox in broad daylight on a Friday. That's pretty risky. So we start adding years. We thought somewhere in the early 30s. End quote. What was odd about Sherry's case was that the man never asked for money, and he never really made it clear what exactly he wanted. John E. Douglas was perplexed. In a 2022 interview, Douglas said, "I've never had a case like this before where the offender doesn't make it clear what he wants." End quote. And I think by saying a case like this, Douglas meant a case where an offender makes off with a loved one, and then calls the victim's family repeatedly afterward, not to ask for anything, but rather to torment the family. The offender seemed only interested in toying with Sherry's mother, giving her false hope that Sherry would be returned, only to terrify Hilda further with that last will and testament. The police traced at least one of the man's calls to a payphone outside an Eckert's pharmacy in the Lexington Town Square shopping center, but the man was gone by the time the cops arrived there. In his next call, the offender directed Hilda Smith to take Highway 378 west to an out-of-the-way structure with a backyard. At this point, 6 days had passed since Sherry had been taken from the driveway. She'd missed her graduation, so not only was Sherry's family suffering from the crime, Sherry's classmates were also traumatized by her being taken in such a manner. Their lives would also be forever changed by this event. Investigators made that drive for Hilda to the out-of-the-way structure. Once there, they found Sherry's lifeless body. The investigators believed that she'd passed away about 2 hours after she'd written her last will and testament on June 1st. That was just 1 day after she'd been taken against her will. So for the 5 days that followed, the anonymous caller had led Sherry's parents to believe she was still alive. He'd done her in not long after he'd taken her. It was clear that the caller had waited all this time in a bid to have forensic evidence on Sherry's body melt away through decomp. One thing that did not melt away, however, were traces of tape on Sherry's face. The coroner concluded that Sherry had been done in either due to this tape over her mouth or she had succumbed to dehydration. Accounts vary as to whether or not the autopsy showed that Sherry had been SA'd. Douglas decided to use the caller's own cruel tactics back on him. More than ever, Douglas wanted to track this guy down. He knew an offender of this type was likely to strike again, so the clock was ticking very loudly. When the offender suddenly stopped calling the Smiths, Douglas recruited Sherry's older sister, Dawn, to help him. A&E True Crime asked Douglas to explain his rationale in bringing the victim's traumatized sister into the investigation. Douglas explained, and I quote, "He had just stopped communicating. He stopped calling the Smiths, and we needed calls. The more calls we get, the more we can analyze. What I also saw is the few times he did call and got in touch with Dawn, we could see there was going to be a fixation on her. She looked very much like her younger sister, and he could be targeting her." End quote. Thus, not only was the family trying to help stop this guy from doing this again, they needed him caught so that their oldest daughter, Dawn, could resume her life without constant fear that this guy was going to track her down and take her away. Dawn, despite how terrifying this situation was, stepped up to the occasion. At this point, she was as bent on tracking down the offender as Douglas was. Dawn reminds me of other sisters who've seen their siblings harmed by violent offenders. Kelsey German, who has been her sister Libby's strongest advocate since the crime in Delphi, Indiana occurred, and Alyssa Turney's sister Sarah, who started a podcast to help get answers about Alyssa's disappearance. And for Sarah Turney, that meant having to do research against her own father, Michael Turney, who is widely believed to be responsible for Alyssa's sudden vanishing in May of 2001. Profiler John E. Douglas told Dawn that when the man next called to try and stall him, in one of the man's subsequent calls to Dawn, he said these bone-chilling words: "God wants you to join Sherry Faye. It's just a matter of time. This month, next month, this year, next year. You can't be protected all the time." End quote. Clearly, this man was watching Dawn, watching the Smith family house, and he was also aware of the police who were trying to protect Dawn and trying to track him down. On the night of Sherry Smith's funeral, the anonymous mystery man called the Smiths once again. This time he described in great detail how he'd done Sherry in to Hilda and Bob, as if Sherry's funeral hadn't been enough for these devastated parents to get through. As investigators continued to try and track the man down, the guy had gotten over his cooling off period, and the thirst to harm another female was back. Just 2 weeks after Sherry Smith was taken, the anonymous offender called the Smiths again. This time he wanted to discuss a 9-year-old girl named Deborah May Helmick. Like Sherry, Deborah had been taken from outside her family home. Deborah lived in a mobile home on Percival Road in Richland County, South Carolina. It was a neighboring county to the one the Smiths lived in. It's unclear why this mystery man called Sherry's parents instead of Deborah's to talk about the crime. Some have speculated that the caller enjoyed talking to Hilda because she came across in a soft, maternal manner. On the day Deborah disappeared, a neighbor heard the little girl scream. The neighbor ran outside, but it was too late. Deborah was already gone. Like Sherry, Deborah had flowing blonde hair in that same Farrah Fawcett style. At this point, the entire state of South Carolina was on edge. Sherry Smith's nabbing was not an isolated event. Every female in South Carolina was a potential next victim. This psychological trauma is similar to what the residents of Moscow, Idaho, as well as the students who attend the University of Idaho are going through. And let's also not forget about the students' parents who are currently struggling with the decision as to whether to send their kids back to Moscow to continue their studies. A police artist drew a sketch of a possible suspect, a bearded man who'd been seen in the vicinity of Helmick's home. As in the Moscow, Idaho case, this case saw many innocent men facing scrutiny, bearded men in particular. Dozens of calls came into the tip line. A number of people suspected a local meter reader, but the leads never went anywhere. The police also ended up arresting 4 people for making false claims and/or for trying to extort money from the Smiths. Can you imagine? The anonymous man ended up calling Deborah's family just as he'd done with Sherry's, and he provided specific instructions on how to find Deborah. When the authorities arrived at that location, they discovered a lifeless Deborah with tape on her face, just as Sherry had had. The break in both cases came when forensic experts noticed indentations on the paper of Sherry's last will and testament. The indentations revealed what looked to be a phone number. The piece of paper that Sherry had written on had obviously come from a notepad that the man had previously jotted things down on. He didn't realize it, but whatever he'd written on an earlier piece of paper had left an imprint on the sheet that he'd forced Sherry to write on. The investigators were able to trace the phone number to a couple named Ellis and Sharon Shepard. They lived just 15 miles from Sherry's family. The authorities were able to track some of the calls the man had made to the Smiths to the Shepards' home phone. But Ellis and Sharon Shepard didn't fit Douglas's profile. Both were middle-aged, both were happily married to one another. But there was other damning evidence at the Shepards' home, including a roll of 22-cent commemorative duck stamps that were found in one of the Shepards' drawers. They matched the stamp that was on the envelope containing Sherry Smith's last will and testament. Some of what appeared to be Sherry's hairs were also located in the Shepards' bathroom. How's that for evidence recovery? I hope this gives everyone who's worried that the case of the 4 University of Idaho students will go cold a little bit of hope. Luckily for the Shepherds, they were out of town when the calls were made from their home to the Smiths' house. They were also out of town when Sherry Smith was taken. After listening to recordings of the mystery man's calls to the Smiths, Ellis Shepard identified the voice as belonging to a guy named Larry Gene Bell. Bell had worked as an electrician in the construction industry and had done some wiring work for Ellis. He'd also house sat for the Shepherds when they were out of town, and Bell fit Douglas's profile. He was Caucasian, 35 years old, and, believe it or not, he worked in the field of electronics. Bell had been married but had gotten divorced in 1976. So yes, he tried marriage, but the marriage failed. And when investigators dug even deeper, they discovered that Bell was likely behind 2 other disappearances: the 1984 disappearance of Sandy Elaine Cornett and the 1975 disappearance of Denise Newsom Port. So Douglas was correct on all points. And there were other disappearances as well, some in North Carolina, that matched Bell's profile to a T. On June 27, 1985, nearly 1 month after Sherry had been taken, the police picked up Larry Gene Bell. The sheriff's police said to Bell, "Do you know who these boys are? These boys are from the FBI, and Mr. Douglas has a profile that fits you to a T." And he's just looking at me. I told him I developed a program on criminal profiling for the FBI. One of the things we found is that the people we talk to, they make it seem dreamlike. They did a crime, but they don't remember doing it. It's like 2 sides to their personality. They have a good side and a bad side. Then I asked, "When did you start feeling bad about this case?" He said, "When I saw the cemetery, I didn't feel good about it." I asked, "What about it?" He said, "All I know is that the good Larry Gene Bell couldn't have done this, but the bad Larry Gene Bell could have." End quote. That was as close to a confession as Douglas would ever get from Larry Gene Bell. Bell was given the maximum sentence and was done in by the authorities in 1996. Bell got the same sentence he had doled out to Sherry Smith and little Deborah Helmick. Could John E. Douglas's methods lead investigators in Moscow to the perpetrator of that crime? I think so. And wouldn't it be great if Douglas came out of retirement to offer his talents to help track down whoever did this to Maddie Mogan, Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, and Kaylee Gonsalves? Until the next time on Bed Crime Stories, do me a favor, smash that like button, subscribe to my channel, leave me a comment, consider a membership.